as the last speaker this morning, I will try to make it very brief and not so intolerable for you. Since day one of this forum, we have been talking about visions and alternative visions. Obviously, it's important for us to see clearly the various visions of the world. But, as the organizers of the forum have shown us in the poster for the forum, the picture is very murky and there's really no end to history and no conquering of one vision over another anytime soon. In the meantime, so it's very important for us, if we choose to be capitalists, we should be good capitalists. If we choose to be socialists, we should be good socialists. How can we do that? We just need to become very good decision makers. How can we become good decision makers? One way is to identify the competing values involved in any decision and properly resolve the competition before a decision is made. As any decision ultimately embodies the resolution of such a competition. As we know, there are an infinite variety of ideas and values in the world and involving any decision, depending on the perspective of each person involved. So it will be impossible for me to go through all of them here. Fortunately, philosophers have organized the world into two basic values, intrinsic and instrumental values, and I will follow this approach here and try to bring out into the open some implicit ways or the framework for seeing and rationalizing the world, and to generalize the issues to a certain level so as to order our examination, analysis, and rationalization in a better way. Now let me offer a few observations on intrinsic and instrumental values as two basic values. The idea is really simple, and before the philosophers here today, I guess I will be making a fool of myself. But anyway, the basic idea is this. For almost everything or every phenomenon in the world, one can find in it or assign to it two values, intrinsic value and instrumental value. And this is also true with human beings, you and me. You can be an intrinsic value or perhaps even an instrumental value. We will see, okay? Each value is virtuous in a different way, and often inherent is used to describe intrinsic value also. An instrumental value is that which is good only as an instrument for something else. I want $1, not to keep it for good, but to use it to buy a cup of coffee. The dollar bill is an instrument for me to obtain my coffee. On the other hand, an intrinsic value is an end value in itself. For example, my experience is an intrinsic value to me. It is unique and it forms part of me, my personhood, and that's it, period. As is obvious, what follows from being treated as an instrumental value may be vastly different from what follows from being treated as an intrinsic value. For example, if indeed we are so special as an end in itself, as Kant taught us many years ago, we, or humanity as a whole, will reign supreme as end units, and not as instrumental units for the glory of the community, nation, society, or even God. If we were only instrumental members in the community, however, we will have to sacrifice us for the benefit of the community, nation, society, or God. Of course, closer to the truth is the position that both values may coexist in us, and one may inform and promote the other. When they do come into conflict, however, which one should prevail is a very difficult question. It's a perennial question for us to consider. Anyway, this is not just philosophers who have applied such a value analysis to the world. Practical decision makers, such as political leaders, as well as legal decision makers like judges, too, have been doing this, although they're not doing this in an ideal way. We can see good examples. For example, we have legal instruments expressly recognizing the various intrinsic values and instrumental values. For example, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights declares that we have to recognize the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Secondly, we also have examples of decision makers who do not use philosophers' parlance, but we know what they're doing is exactly what the philosophers have been doing. And you can see this in the US Supreme Court's cases in affirmative action in education, which we may come to briefly. I have time. Okay? Sometimes I think even when decision makers do not do any such analysis, their decisions can be rationalized as such, and there's a cottage industry in the academia to do such rationalizing. For example, at the first plenary meeting, we have a speaker talking about principles of property law, and we know that in property law principles we have something called numerous clauses. The idea that under legislation there is a mandatory limit to the types of property available, and judges cannot expand that list. An influential view seems to be that this principle reflects the instrumental value of efficiency. It is easier for the transfer of property if we have a fixed typology so that we can easily tell what we are giving and what we are getting. But this principle was adopted a long time ago before the law and economic analysis came about. So what this reasoning is telling us is really a latter-day post-facto rationalization. Personally, I believe that the principle embodies the intrinsic value of self-determination and sovereignty that representatives of people, Parliament, decides, and that's where sovereignty is located, and not the judges who will decide. Okay? This view probably will be consistent with the history of the emergence of the principle. Now, if we can see the world that way, we can identify many disputes as having conflicts or clashes of these values, intrinsic values and instrumental values. The resolutions of such disputes is then a choice between such values within the same category, an intrinsic value versus another intrinsic value, or an instrumental value versus another instrumental value, or between two values from different categories, an intrinsic value versus an instrumental value. Roughly speaking, a reasonable person under normal circumstances would probably choose the more efficient one between two instrumental values, and the more important one between an intrinsic value and an instrumental value. Furthermore, one will have to give priority to an intrinsic value in the last situation if the intrinsic value is as important or perhaps slightly less so than the instrumental value. Society as a whole, however, most likely will opt for the value perceived to be more important and achievable, often in a most unnuanced fashion and without the benefit of an explicit intrinsic versus instrumental value analysis. Such a choice may exhibit itself in law and in quite a few other situations. And I have several examples here, but the problem is that we are running out of time. Maybe let me quickly run through some examples that I consider to be interesting. The first one is perhaps for those lawyers, is Article 4 of the ICCPR. Under that article, either the life of the nation is considered to be a value more important than the intrinsic value of many of the human rights, or the instrumental value of the forfeiture of many of these rights is more important than the intrinsic value of these rights. There's a provision that says, in time of public emergency which threatens the life of the nation and the existence of which is officially proclaimed, the states party to the present covenant may take measures derogating from these obligations under the present covenant to the extent strictly required by the exigencies of the situation, provided that such measures are not inconsistent with their other obligations under international law and do not involve discrimination solely on the ground of race, color, sex, language, religion, or social origin. Now you can see this is a result of a very interesting calculation. And I will not go into the details now, but let me move to another one. As I mentioned earlier, in the US, there are many affirmative action cases basically dealing with a conflict between the rights of an applicant and the rights of the school in promoting the diversity in the student body. One would perhaps see a conflict between the right of the individual applicant from discrimination, and the value of the school in somehow helping the students getting a very good education. So probably there is a conflict between an intrinsic value of the individual from discrimination and the instrumental value of the university in having such a program. But most of the time, the cases in the US did not do such an analysis in an expressive way. What the courts do, it usually will ask whether diversity is a compelling interest that can justify the narrowly tailored use of race in selecting applicants for admission to public universities. The question was analyzed and answered in a way so that the challenger, the applicant, seemed to have disappeared from the picture, as if the compelling interest, which was an instrument to obtain the assorted educational benefits, was some sort of force majeure, making it futile to address other rights and interests. Anyway, that's the class of values there that we have to recognize, or we can recognize, even if the judges do not want to do so. Now let me go to Mr. Diallo's case, which I think is a heartbreaking case, and I hope this case probably will give us some troubling kind of calculations to do in life. Mr. Diallo was a young African immigrant who had returned to his building on the night of 4th February 1999 in the Bronx. At about 12:40 a.m. on that night, 4 New York police officers, all in street clothes, approached Mr. Diallo on the stoop of his building and fired 41 shots, striking him 19 times. As he retreated inside, the officers, who are all white, said that they had thought he had a gun. It turned out to be a wallet. The police perpetrators were acquitted in a subsequent prosecution by a jury consisting of 4 blacks and 8 whites, because in each view, the officers, was conducting reasonable self-defense. So the police perpetrators were reasonably doing things what a society, supposed to do. In the jury's mind, then, although what the perpetrators did was in fact wrong, it was considered to be legitimate in belief for the good of society. Just earlier, we heard Professor Merkel told us that no one, can be asked to sacrifice him or herself for the good of society. Well, then we have an example here. Okay, we do not see any express explanation of its action by the jury, but what it did can be rationalized this way. Okay, while the mistaken self-defense cost the life of Mr. Diallo, it was legitimate and necessary for society, at least the particular version of it in the Bronx, to survive. That is to say, it was all right for Mr. Diallo to die for the good of society. 2 versions of the conflict of values are apparent. One version would be between Mr. Diallo's life as an intrinsic value to him and his death as an instrumental value to society, and one between his life as an intrinsic value and the survival of the society ultimately as an intrinsic value. The intrinsic value of Mr. Diallo's life was apparently considered not as so important as his death's instrumental value to society or as the intrinsic value of the survival of society. It is a very troubling calculation. I do not know what to say, but I'm reporting to you. I hope you will consider this. I have another example about 2 tales of the lunar embassy. And this, in fact, goes to the fundamentals of different visions of the world in this way. Okay. Now we know that there's an entity called Lunar Embassy with its headquarters in Nevada, the USA, and branches all over the world. That entity is selling land on the moon to willing takers. In China, a branch incorporating as a company was doing this, and the local business administration considered that to be unlawful and imposed penalties on the company. The company sought judicial review, and immediate People's Court in Beijing ruled that the sales of land on the moon indeed constituted unlawful conduct of business because the Outer Space Treaty prohibits the appropriation of outer space objects. However, in the state of Nevada, where the Lunar Embassy has its headquarters, selling land you cannot walk, drive, or fly to is perfectly legal. Once Mr. Tom Sargent, a spokesperson for the state attorney general, was asked about this particular piece of business, apparently, as long as the company pays its $100 fee every year and no one complains, the embassy is licensed in good standing. So far, no one complains. So, and people in Mr. Sargent's office, the Attorney General's office, and his own family have bought parcels on the moon. So the question was, do they believe they have purchased a real acre on the moon? Mr. Sargent replied, well, my son certainly thinks he owns one. Mr. Sargent replied, my son is 10 years old, and the piece of certificate is on his wall in the bedroom. Now, the two cases seem to me to epitomize interesting things, right? It seems to epitomize two different ways to resolve the competition between intrinsic and instrumental values. The Chinese decision perhaps can be characterized as giving priority to the instrumental value of a stable business order over the intrinsic value of free enterprise or freedom of conducting business. The Nevada approach can be characterized as giving priority to the intrinsic value of the autonomous decision-making of the buyers over the instrumental value of a stable business order. One might even perhaps say that the two approaches also epitomize two different ways to business regulation. It seems that the Chinese approach emphasizes the quality of business products and instrumental value consideration probably, while the Nevada approach privileges autonomy in decision-making by the purchasers, which usually emphasizes disclosure of relevant information. Of course, the disadvantages of the Chinese approach are in the difficulty in ensuring quality of business products and the inefficiency in attempting to do so in every respect, right? The disadvantages of the Nevada approach are in the difficulty in providing perfect disclosure and in reaching a rational decision even with perfect disclosure of information. Perhaps you may be surprised that you can find images of these two approaches in the unfolding and the aftermath of the 2008 world financial crisis, in which both imperfect disclosure and irrational decision-making play an important role. Different approaches, of course, led to different damage afterwards. Anyway, here perhaps I would like to follow on to Professor Merkel's discussion on democratic intervention. I think it would be very interesting if we do a value calculation as I have proposed here. Perhaps we can see a conflict between democracy and existing regime, okay? Or democracy, or the establishment of it, and the people who will be killed in the efforts to establish democracy, right? And ultimately, it seems to me that it will be a choice between many people who will suffer sudden, deaths and dramatic injuries in the effort or intervention to establish democracy, and perhaps many more people who will suffer to a lesser extent the things that they do not like, but for a much longer period of time, because democracy may come much later. Of course, at the end of the day, we may have to ask whether democracy itself may be an intrinsic value or a desirable value that we have to pursue. We have a difficult calculation to do. That's what I hope I'm trying to present to you. In any event, I have given you my idea about how difficult it is to strike a balance between all these different competing values, and that the calculations may be troubling and may be hefty, and we may not like to do it ourselves. But in my view, it is always important for us to be conscious of what we are doing, and I'm not championing any particular vision of the world, what I'm asking for is clearer and better analysis that tackle such conflicts in a more direct way. Indeed, it would be desirable, perhaps before any important decision is made, it would be desirable for the relevant decision maker or decision makers to conduct a calculation of the competition of values in a formal way, perhaps writing things out like what they have in environmental law and environmental impact assessment. If we do this, perhaps we may make a better decision. Perhaps you may say that this is quite simplistic, right? Instrumental value and intrinsic value. But to the extent that we know computer sciences can do great things with 0 and 1, we can be sure that political leaders can do great things with intrinsic values and instrumental values. Thank you very much for your attention.